Welcome back, everyone, as we continue to talk about the Great War, World War One. And today I thought I'd do something a little different. I've been asked to do these every so often, tier lists, and I typically use the tier maker site during live streams, but I thought I would do a regular video today. And today we're going to be ranking the top contributors to the First World War and where they rank on the tier list. S being, superior, the best, the top of the heap. A, B, C, and D is how we have it. So that's how they did it. I'm not going to add any tiers to that. I might add an incomplete or a basically one a place for countries that I really don't feel like had a significant impact one way or the other. But I would love to hear your thoughts about this. Use the comment section below. Tell me what I got right. Tell me what I got wrong and why. Just a fun thought exercise, something to give us another way of looking at each of these nations that contributed to what we call World War One. Let's dive in. Okay, so let's start with what to me is the biggest no-brainer here, and that is the German Empire. To me, clearly S tier. Germany basically, and I want to point out, I'm talking strictly on performance in the war. All right, I'm not ranking this on good and bad. I'm not ranking this on whose fault it was that got into the war. I'm strictly going on how did they do in terms of once they were in the war, those kinds of things, and their contribution to it. And to me, Germany is S tier. Best army in the war, bar none. Best army on either side. Had some of the best tactics during the war. Great innovations. Yes, they also contributed things like the first introduction of poison gas, which eventually gets used on both sides. Things like that. But performance-wise, bar none. Now, early on, some pretty serious missteps. They kind of hurl folks into the fight. They get bogged down in a couple of places. But by and large, Germany is taking on all of Europe by themselves. I'm looking at you, Austria Hungary. Thanks for nothing, really. So that gives you a little hint of where I'm going with them. I think Germany just, considering what they were up against and how long they held out and the fact that they were dealing with a blockade that severely hampered their supplies, if they had gotten the least bit of competent support from the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans, if they didn't have to deal with the blockade, and honestly, even without all of those things, they very nearly pulled it off. So to me, Germany, easy S tier. Okay, next let's talk about one of the smaller powers involved in this war. And granted, I'm going to be there in a couple of weeks, so maybe I'm letting my affinity for this nation blind me a little bit. But for me, I'm going to put Belgium at an A. A couple of reasons why. Number one, I think without Belgium, Germany wins the war. And I don't say that lightly. Number one, Belgium could have just stayed neutral. If Belgium stays neutral, Germany wins the war easily. Because there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, Belgium basically standing up to Germany's ultimatum. Germany gives this ultimatum that basically says, let our troops pass through your country. Because the whole idea of the Schlieffen Plan, which is the German plan for a two-front war with Russia on one side, France and other allies on the other side, is they've got to go around the strong French defenses around places like Verdun. And to do that, they're going to have to go through Belgium. And so it's a quick strike through Belgium, get around the French, get at Paris, outflank the French before they know what hit them. And that requires getting through Belgium quickly. And so, number one, they give this ultimatum to the king of the Belgians that basically says, let us pass through. We won't hurt your people. We're not going to do anything. We just want to get through to get to France. He could have said, okay, Belgium would have been spared. Germany wins the war probably in the fall of 1914. Number two, when he does decide to fight, they fight well. Now, they do get overrun, but just bogging the Germans down in places like Liège. Liège, the Germans, because this is an industrial war and they're funneling, hundreds of thousands of troops quickly through Belgium, they've got to be able to supply them and keep it moving quickly. That's all part of this plan. And getting bogged down in Liège slows the whole thing to a halt, and the trains have to go through Liège, and so Liège has to be taken. They can't go around it. And so it slows the whole thing down, and that buys time for the British to get into line at places like Mons, and it gives time for the French to kind of get their act together and redeploy to handle what's happening with the Schlieffen Plan. And so just slowing them down and basically sacrificing their country to slow down Germany is huge. And to me, that alone gives Belgium an A. They hang on to a little sliver of the country over and around Ypres. Ypres is completely destroyed during the war. And the Belgians continue to contribute, continue to fight throughout the war, despite just horrible losses and the terrible things that are done to the Belgian civilian population. Deserves an A in my book. And I really don't know how I forgot the most important part. Well, I shouldn't say the most important part, but one of the most important components of this is that Belgium fighting brings the British into the war. And with the British come the British Commonwealth, the Canadians, New Zealand, Australia, what we know today is India, British Raj, and all of these countries, because the British weren't automatically in the war when the French came in and the Russians came in. But Belgium being invaded, that drags them in. Now, I truly believe the British would have eventually entered the war anyway, but I think by the time they would have made that decision, the war might be over. So Belgium standing also brings the British and her dominions into the combat. All right, let's go to the first one on the list here. We're looking at Bulgaria. Now, Bulgaria is an interesting one for me, and I'll be honest up front. I don't know a ton about a lot of what went on in the Balkan front during the war, but I know a couple of things about Bulgaria. Number one, I think they really punched above their weight class. It's kind of the opposite to me of Austria Hungary, who I felt like as a major power really performed like a minor power. Bulgaria is one of those nations that I feel like really did well for their size. They joined the Central Powers in 1915. They're the smallest of the Central Powers, alongside such heavyweights as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They jump in. A lot of these countries who are going to come into the war later on aren't coming in because of alliances. They're coming in because they've got a particular interest in mind, some self-interest. Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, countries like that. But Bulgaria coming in does a couple of things. Number one, it's the end of Serbia, who's held out, and we'll get to Serbia in a few minutes. So Bulgaria spells the end of Serbia, which I think helps open up the Austro-Hungarians to be able to do more against the Italians, for example. It also is huge when Romania joins the war on the side of the Entente in 1916, because Bulgaria just manhandles Romania, and Romania is a bigger country. So I feel like Bulgaria does really, really well, but they're also then the first of the Central Powers to fall in 1918. But I think that was just inevitable. But Bulgaria's in that kind of Balkan region where all of this is kind of the powder keg of Europe, and it all kind of gets going, and there's a lot of bad feelings between some of these countries because they've just had a couple of wars there. So there's a lot going on. But I really feel like Bulgaria did very well for themselves, and to me, at least deserves to be a B. I might have even put them at A, but I don't want this to be too top heavy. So I might shift these around before I'm done once I see where everybody kind of comes out. But I'm going to give Bulgaria a B. All right, that brings me to Austria Hungary. They're sitting right here. I've already kind of alluded to, I feel like Austria Hungary just was a crap show. And it seems like every time they start fighting, they're calling to Big Brother Germany for help, which is quite a thing considering Austria Hungary is kind of at the center of making this war happen in the first place. So I always felt like they were just always the incompetent younger brother of the Germans, and just I honestly just cannot think of any really important positive contributions that they made that weren't heavily outweighed by negative things that they kind of dragged down. I almost feel like if Austria-Hungary weren't in the war at all, it might have gone better for Germany. I know that that's not the case. But to me, Austria-Hungary is a D. I really just don't need to say a whole lot more than that. They just for so many reasons, just were not good in this war at all. Speaking of crap shows, let's talk about Russia for a minute. Russia, of course, is one of the big X factors in all of this because they've got a massive amount of manpower, and everybody expects them to be slow to mobilize, and that's the whole idea behind the Schlieffen Plan for the Germans, is that it's going to take Russia, big, slow, bare Russia, a while to get in position to fight, so they've got time to deal with France, and then they can come back and deal with Russia. Well, Russia mobilizes faster. Russia also, though I'm not considering this as a factor, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not considering the reasons why and the entry into the war, those kinds of things. I feel like Russia doesn't get nearly enough blame for this war happening in the first place. If they would have just stood down their mobilization, I feel like it all could have been avoided. That's not to say that there aren't other countries that are heavily to blame for it. I just feel like Russia doesn't get enough of it. But Russia's got so many internal issues going on that between that and some poor performances on the battlefield, they, to me, are also going to be in the D tier. Tannenberg's a disaster. And the collapse of the Eastern Front very nearly dooms the Allies. And honestly, if it had happened a few weeks earlier, it might have doomed the Allies. I'm trying to fly through these pretty quick, so I'm not getting into a great deal of detail in all of these. But I feel like just Russia was just such a mess from the beginning and never really fully got their act together. I feel like they were poorly led for large parts of this war. And I feel like they could have probably done a lot more to bring down the Germans in the East than they did. All right, so let's talk about France for a minute. So France obviously is on the Allied side, the major power on the Western Front. They contribute more than anybody else on that front, and obviously most of that front takes place in their country. So they got a lot to fight for. The French, the Germans, the Austria Hungarians, all lose somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3.5–4% of their population in this war. Some populations much higher, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. But for an American audience, that's the equivalent of us losing 13 million people today in a war. That's and they weren't all military. There were a lot of civilians as well. But France suffered terribly in this war, not only in terms of deaths, but just in terms of the destruction to their own nation. And I feel by and large did pretty well. There were some issues here and there. And you got to remember, too, that the Allies have a unique challenge in this war in that you've got, along the Western Front, you've got the French and the British. Later on, you'll have the Americans. You've got Russian troops fighting on the Western Front. And you're kind of having to deal with this conglomeration of all these different nations and who's going to be in charge and who's making the decisions and having to coordinate and kind of do all that. The French basically are the leaders in this war. And I feel like they do pretty good, and they hold their ground big time in places like Verdun, for example. Also make some mistakes, I think, along the way. So to me, I can't put them at S tier. But I think I will put France at A. I feel like their contributions are pretty solid. I can't think of any major blunders. And in places like the First Battle of the Marne, for example, they stop the Germans dead in their tracks when it seems like the Germans are going to march all the way to Paris. And they do that pretty much on their own because the British aren't there in any large numbers yet. It's going to be a year or two before the British are able to put like 1 million men on the line, that kind of thing. They just don't have that kind of an army yet. And of course, the French have, like a lot of nations, they rely very heavily on some of their colonies and colonial troops that they're able to get into position to. And some of those colonial troops don't maybe perform quite as well. Understandably so. They don't have as much skin in the game. They're not fighting for the same things that France is fighting for. But I feel like they did pretty well. Now, speaking of punching above your weight class, let's talk about Serbia. Now, again, not going to get into the factors that lead to the war and the blame that might or might not lie with Serbia for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, because you can outweigh that then also with the fact that they basically caved to pretty much all of the demands made by Austria Hungary, except one, and understandably so on that one. But we're talking strictly about their performance in the war. And Serbia, this tiny country, facing off against the might of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, and they do so well. And it's only when Bulgaria comes into the war that Serbia just can't hold any longer. And they end up losing, by some estimates, maybe as high as 1/4 of their population dies in this war. That is absolutely brutal. Americans, that's 80 million of us. 80 million of us would be 1/4 of the population. It's just ridiculous what they go through and the suffering that takes place. And like a lot of these countries, these losses are not simply military on the battlefield. These are also civilian losses. You know, places like Germany, the estimates for Germany, for example, on the number of civilians who died as a result of things like the blockade, things like that, they get pretty close to the number of combat deaths. So a lot of these countries maybe even had more deaths from disease and civilians than they did from combat deaths. But so for me, Serbia, again, they're going to be an A. They fought really, really well, held on a long time, and eventually just were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers involved of what they were facing, but did really, really well with what they had. Now, speaking of all of this stuff, one of the things that I just want to talk about real quick that's not necessarily related to the tier list, but I just think is really interesting to point out is just looking at, this is a table of the casualties, 1914 to 1918, of all the countries that were involved in the war. And you can sort this by population, you can sort it by combat deaths, total military deaths, and so that would include things like accidents, things like deaths from disease, stuff like that. Civilian deaths in both military action and crimes against humanity, an increase in civilian deaths. In other words, civilian deaths that maybe aren't directly related, like they weren't killed by armies or they weren't killed by military action, but they died as a result of things like the blockade. In other words, more deaths than would have been expected in that time period. And that excludes the influenza pandemic. And then you have total deaths from all causes. Deaths as a percentage of population, and then the number of military wounded. And one thing that's interesting to point out right away is just looking at the population of the Allied powers versus the Central Powers. Central Powers being Germany, Austria Hungary, Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria. Basically the Central Powers are outnumbered about 6-1, 5-1. But the Allied powers take 50% more casualties, or more combat deaths, I should say. And wounded, it seems like about the same. But deaths as a percentage of population, you're looking at 5 to 6% of the Central Powers versus about 1% of the Allied powers. And then, of course, it's sorted by all the different nations, and that's where I'm talking about. Deaths as a percentage of the population. You're looking at Persia, which is kind of roughly modern day Iran, 19%. Serbia, anywhere from 17 to 28%. The Ottomans, 13 to 15%. The Romanians, 8 to 9%. And of course, France, Austria Hungary, Germany, all around 4%. Bulgaria, Greece, Italy, UK, up there as well. And then you get kind of to some of these other nations down there. But it's just an interesting thing. If you want to just go to Wikipedia, just look up World War I casualties. They've got all of it sorted there, and they've got the documentation for where that information is coming from. All right, let's talk about the British for a second here. And granted, you'll notice, for example, you don't see like the Canadian flag here, or New Zealand or Australia, things like that. Basically, when we're talking about the British, same thing with the French and others, we're talking about their colonies and their kind of associated realms. And so when we talk about the British, with all apologies to the Canadians and the Anzacs and folks like that, because listen, Canada and the Anzacs, for example, when I go to Ypres, you're going to hear some of their stories. There may not have been better troops on the Western Front than the Canadians. I mean, seriously. And the Australian and New Zealand folks performed so well. So it is a disservice to them to just lump them in with the British. But for the purposes of this, that's what we're doing. And I feel like they did really, really well, considering. Small force at the beginning, very professional army, but we also have to consider the Navy. And I feel like without the British Navy, this war is impossible to win for the Allies. The British Navy, I feel like maybe more than any other factor, brings Germany to its knees by the end of the war. Did they make some mistakes? Absolutely. I mean, the Somme was a mess. It should never have happened. And honestly, that was one of the challenges of being allied powers kind of coordinating together, is that you end up with things like the Somme, which I think the Somme never happens if it's not for the fact that it's where the British and British and French lines come together. And so that's why they choose to attack there, even though it's really not a good place to attack. But the way the British held at Ypres, for example, and like I said, the Canadians who, some of the Canadian troops that I've been studying going into my trip to Ypres, wow, holy cow. And of course, Newfoundland places, the Newfoundland regiment at the Somme, incredible stuff. I feel poorly led at times. I think Hague was a crap show, speaking of those things. So I feel like there's enough mitigating circumstances to keep me from being willing to put the British at S tier. But they're going to be another A for me. I feel like there's a lot of A's happening right now on the Allied side. But yeah, to me, I feel like that they probably deserve to be there. Okay, let's talk about my own country, the United States of America. So the U.S.'s contribution to the war, I feel like, happens long before they militarily get involved. Despite Woodrow Wilson's best attempts at appearing neutral, he was not. Doing a lot to support the Allies, not to the degree that Franklin Roosevelt does in World War II before entering the war, but definitely there's some contribution there. Militarily, the U.S. only comes in at the very end, really only gets involved in 1918 in combat, but I feel like just the impact of the potential of the U.S. Showing up militarily in large numbers has a strong effect on German strategy. And I feel like had the U.S. entered the war a few months later than they did, we might see a different outcome. Because the timing of the U.S. entering the war overlaps so nicely with the collapse of the Russians on the Eastern Front that I think if either of those things had happened on a different timeline, it might be a different outcome. So I feel like the numbers in terms of the U.S. involvement and the number of casualties the U.S. takes don't tell the whole story. That said, the U.S., when you compare to Germany and Austria Hungary and France and the British and some of these other nations, just you can't compare in terms of the impact. To me, the U.S. is a C, only because they weren't involved longer. And the involvement on the ground, I feel like, has less of an impact than just kind of the psychological impact on the Germans of the U.S. entering the war. But I do think the U.S. gives that little boost that is needed to kind of help push the Allies over the finish line. But certainly not near the contribution that the United States will give in World War II, either militarily or economically. So for me, it's going to be a solid C. Okay, let's talk about Italy. Italy comes in later in the war. They start out the war nominally allied with the Central Powers, but they're not really obligated to come into the fight, things like that. But they had kind of sided with them in the years leading up to the war, and Italy's going through its own kind of changing and growth, and they're a fairly new country as far as a unified country goes, kind of like Germany is. But they eventually jump in mainly over the Allies promising them a better deal in terms of how territory is going to be divided up than anything Central Powers were willing to give, because Austria Hungary owned some territory that Italy really wanted. And they'd been fighting over for a long time, very similar to what you have with Germany and France with Alsace and Lorraine. So Italy jumps in, and immediately the whole Isonzo front turns into this meat grinder, where both sides, the Austro-Hungarians and the Italians, are just pouring troops in, and really very little is changing. You don't see a lot of movement either way there. So what's the positive? Well, Italy bogs down a bunch of Austro-Hungarian troops that might have otherwise been used against places like Serbia, Russia, Romania. What's the negative? They really don't offer much beyond that. So I don't know. I feel like their entrance into the war does prevent those troops from being used elsewhere. But then again, Austria-Hungary really hadn't been doing much up to that point anyway. So Italy, to me, just because they did enough to occupy the Austro-Hungarians and cause a lot of casualties there, I'll give them a C. But I feel like they didn't contribute anything beyond that for the most part. All right, let's talk about Romania. So Romania, we've already talked a little bit about in terms of very similar to Italy in terms of kind of coming into the war later with its own strategic goals and kind of seeing an opportunity to maybe gain some things for themselves by aligning themselves with the Allies. And they do come in at a time when it's a pretty interesting situation. We're getting closer to when the Russians are going to collapse. But honestly, to me, Romania, I feel like ends up being more of a drag on the Allies than anything else. The Russians kind of have to bail them out. Romania initially loses probably 2/3, 3/4 of their territory to folks like the Bulgarians. Now, granted, when I talk about the Bulgarians, I also have to keep in mind that Germany helps the Bulgarians a lot. Erich von Falkenhayn, who at one time was the chief of the German General Staff, by this time is no longer the chief of the General Staff. He's been supplanted in that role by Hindenburg. So Falkenhayn ends up going down into the Balkans, and he ends up kind of leading the situation down in the area with Bulgaria and Romania and stuff like that, and I think helps a lot in that situation. But I just feel like when I think of countries who jumped into the war later on and then just sucked, Romania comes to mind for me on that. To me, Romania is another D power in all of this. I feel like they did more harm than good to the Allied cause. All right, let's talk about the Ottomans. The Ottomans, by the time of World War I, are an empire in vast decline. I mean, they're on their way out. I feel like they're the one of the empires that didn't really survive World War I. I mean, they survived briefly, but that I think would have probably not survived anyway, as compared to some of the others. But they do have some things to their credit. For example, I mean, they fight really, really well at Gallipoli. Probably one of the biggest stains on the British for this war is in Gallipoli. They occupy the British in places the British wouldn't have otherwise had to fight. You know, the British are one of those powers that's fighting this war on many fronts. Gallipoli, Africa, the Middle East, the Western Front. So, in that sense, the Ottomans do a lot because it prevents the British from being able to concentrate their forces in places like the Balkans or on the Western Front because they got to fight so many other places. So I feel like that was a significant factor in the war, and I think that helped drag the war out some. So I feel like the Ottomans, to me, aren't quite on the level of a D tier for those reasons. But I also feel like not a lot of like real strong positives either. They're just kind of meh for me. But I feel like considering where they were going into this war, they probably helped the Central Powers a lot more than people realize. So to be honest, beyond that, the flags we're looking at are of countries that I feel like did not contribute enough to the overall war effort to warrant being ranked, as far as I'm concerned. Now, some of you can argue that with me. And give me your reasons in the comment section below why you feel I should have included Portugal or Japan or Argentina or Cuba or some of these other countries that are listed here. But I just feel like in looking over the numbers in terms of their military involvement and their economic involvement, that none of them to me had a war-changing level of involvement in the war. So I'm going to keep my rankings to the powers that you see listed there. So tell me why I'm wrong about that, and tell me what you think about my tier list. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? So we've got Germany as the lone S tier. We've got Belgium, France, Serbia, and the UK as A tiers. And I would say that within that, to me, the UK probably is above the others. The other three there. So if I were to further divide that maybe to like an S- or an A+, I'd probably put them there. We've got Bulgaria as a lone B tier. We've got the US, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire in the C tier. And then we've got Austria Hungary, Russia, and Romania as our D tier. Use the comment section below. Let me know what you agree with, what you don't agree with, what you would change, what your rankings would be. Let's use this as an opportunity to talk about these things. And like I said, I didn't get into a ton of detail because I was trying to get through so many of these. So this is really just more of a kind of a fun thing to do. Please hit that like button if you would. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.